Okay, so we have 100 people, 112. Good afternoon, everyone. We're just waiting for everyone to join in. Okay, sort of stabilized. So let's begin. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here on this very rainy afternoon for some of us. My name is Luis Alberto. I was a visiting student at Harvard College in 2017, 2018, and I've had the opportunity to contribute to some of the work the International Negotiation Program has been doing throughout Brazil and Latin America. And I'm extremely honored to be here today introducing this amazing panel. First of all, I'd like to thank the Harvard Brazil office, especially Helena Monteiro, Tim Lindem, and Breno Carvalho for putting this event together. I'd also like to thank the Alumni Club of Brazil, especially Thais Gasparian, who's been of tremendous help in our efforts of promoting dialogue across Brazil. It is phenomenal to have Professor Shapiro and Guga Chacra with us this afternoon. We know that we negotiate every day within our families, our jobs, our politics, even within ourselves. And I strongly believe that understanding the processes of these negotiations is almost like a superpower for success that is all within our reach. Professor Shapiro is one of the greatest experts in negotiation and conflict management in the world. His work in promoting peace and dialogue has been a gift to mankind, and his work in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and around the world has been fundamental to the resolution of crises that are many, many centuries in the making. Dan Shapiro is the founder and director of the Harvard International Negotiation Program. He's a professor at the Harvard Medical School and at the college, and an author of many best-selling books on negotiation and conflict resolution. His new book, Negotiating the Non-Negotiable, was just published in Brazil by Globo Livros, and it should be in reach of most of us in this call today. We're also extremely honored to have Guga Chacra in this call. Guga is certainly a part of the collective memory of the entire country of Brazil when it comes to discussing politics and international relations. Guga is a very proud master's in international relations from Columbia University, an author of many books that range from history to soccer to journalism itself, and a writer at Jornal Globo and commentator on HACB, TV Globo, and Globo News. Dan and Guga, it is an absolute pleasure to have you two with us today. And Professor Shapiro, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Luis. Thank you all who helped to organize this event, to Guga for joining as well. It is really an honor, a privilege, a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I must start. Wait, Luis, could you turn your camera on for just one more second if you're able to? I must say, yes, one of the great privileges of teaching and at a place like Harvard is you get students of the most incredible intellectual capacity. And I find, although I call it teaching, it to me is really learning with students, constantly learning through their questions, their curiosities, their different ways of seeing the world. And it was in 2017 when Luis and I had the opportunity to meet when he was in my class. And I've learned an incredible amount from you, Luis, about Brazil, about negotiations. So I just want to say a special thank you to you for all of your inspiration. So you can stay on camera or not as you'd like now, but I just wanted to say a thank you there. So I was asked to share about 15 or 20 minutes of background. And the challenge that was given to me was don't use slides. To me, slides are the security blanket. So without slides, I'm going to be sort of surfing a little bit. But I thought I'd start by going a little bit more personal to how I became involved in the field of conflict resolution and some of the key moments in my own development as someone fascinated with this field and believing and the importance of this field of conflict resolution. I grew up in the capital of the state of Pennsylvania in the United States, in Harrisburg, which was, a medium-sized city. And my parents, a middle-class family, my father was always interested in political science. And so my parents occasionally traveled. They traveled at one point to Peru to see Machu Picchu. At another point in time, they became very interested in communism. What does the communist system look like for real? And so it was in the early 1980s that my parents traveled to Eastern Europe, to Hungary. And while they were there, they became very friendly with their tour guide. It turns out their tour guide, his profession was that of a psychologist, but under communism, he made virtually no compensation through psychology. So black market, he was a tour guide, and he was brought my parents all around Hungary, showed them Budapest and so on. They became very good friends. Falus Gabor, the tour guide, eventually came to the United States. It was still early 1980s, visited my family, met myself and my sister, and he said, I have a son just about your age. Let's figure out how to get Falus András, Andy, from communist Hungary to capitalist United States for the year to study. Now, many of you on this call, I don't know what ages you are, I can't see you, but I'd imagine many of you lived through at least parts of the Cold War, and you will remember how divisive that world was. I remember in middle school, the worst swear word that you could say in English was not starting with an F or an S, it was you commie, you communist. It took about a year to get Andy from Eastern Europe to the United States. The communist government of Hungary was scared to death that their 15-year-old premier violinist, as he was, would defect to the United States, and the US government was scared to death that this communist, quote unquote communist, was going to contaminate the innocent, pure youth of the United States. Neither happened, but we learned a lot. I remember meeting Andy for the first time, having all of these stereotypes of communism. What is a communist gonna look like? And I just come back from camp. Andy's there, he had long black hair. He's listening to his headphones. He's listening to rap music, to the Beastie Boys. I don't know if any of you know the Beastie Boys. I loved the Beastie Boys. He did. He spoke no English. I spoke no Hungarian at the time, but we connected. We became best friends. Here was this broad political system distancing people, and yet two human beings coming together. Part 2 of 3 parts. Part 2, I then went after that year to visit Andy and stay with him and his father in Eastern Europe. And this was now mid-1980s. And we traveled all around Eastern Central Europe. So I got to really see and feel this political system at work. And I became fascinated with the region, with the depth of culture that was there, something not known to me to the same extent in the United States. And so when the wall fell in Eastern Central Europe, I was asking myself, how can I help my friend? How can I help Andy and everybody else who is now moving 1989, 1990 from one political system to a different one? I'd always been interested in conflict resolution. I'd always been interested in psychology, how the human mind works. I approached what was in a very small organization to ask them for funding, which I got, to build a program on conflict management for youth in Eastern and Central Europe. The idea was, how do you deal with conflict in an open society at a very human level? I spent the next 5 years researching, developing this curriculum, traveling to about 18 countries across that region to work with teachers, students, other educators, political people, political officials, all to build this curriculum, which ultimately stretched across 30 countries. It reached more than 1 million youth. Act 3, final act before Guga, I'll turn it to you for our conversation. Act 3, this work in negotiation in the early 1990s brought me to many different places as I was building this curriculum and spreading it. And one was during what was then the imploding Yugoslavia. So it was during the war in what I'll call Yugoslavia right now, but in that region, I was working with refugees in Serbia, in Croatia, in Macedonia, and hearing their stories. Working with kids, 7, 10, 12 years old, talking about the violence they had witnessed, physical violence upon some of them themselves, and going, boy, there has to be a better way of dealing with conflict than this. And at the time, while I was in that region, I was watching the international community come in to offer support, and in the post-conflict transitional processes as well. And they were offering military support, political support, economic support. But the question in my head was, how do you deal with human beings? How do you deal with the human transition from one political system to a very different political system? And this brought me very much in heart and soul into the work I've done since, which is how do you deal with the emotional and the identity-based dimensions of conflict and negotiation? At that point in time, up until the early mid-1990s, the dominant approach to negotiation that was taught at universities, taught in businesses and governments, it was rational. How do you problem solve your differences? Those are essential concepts. We need it. But rationality is not enough. And so, again, my time since has really been working to build a body of ideas to help all of us in the political realm, the social realm, everyday family realm, deal with the emotional and the identity-based dimensions of conflict more effectively. It was in 2000 that I established the Harvard International Negotiation Program that Luis had mentioned earlier, a place where we do try to really cultivate new ideas on how to deal with these deeper dimensions of negotiation and conflict. Anyway, I should probably stop there, in large part because I want to learn from Guga. We've had the opportunity to connect, and I have great admiration for you, Guga. I look forward to our conversation together today on all of these topics.
Professor, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here in this panel with you, to be invited by the Harvard alumni in Brazil. And I want to ask questions to you. And I was reading your book and this thing about identity. I grew up in São Paulo, Brazil, in an upper middle class family. And I saw myself at the time as a Brazilian with Lebanese roots, but mainly Brazilian from São Paulo and a water polo player. That's how I saw myself. That was my identity when I grew up. Now, like, I am a Brazilian immigrant to the United States who became closer to my roots, to my Lebanese roots. I am a Lebanese citizen as well. My grandparents are from Lebanon, with 2 kids who were born in the United States, in New York, who are growing up in the United States, whose parents are Brazilians, who have the Italian passport and are allowed to have the Lebanese citizenship as well. So all this thing about identity, and when I am in Brazil, I don't think about religion. I'm an atheist. I was not baptized. My parents were not religious. But when I go to Lebanon, even in my citizenship, it's written that I'm a Christian Greek Orthodox, a Rune Orthodox, as they say. And when I go to Lebanon, first thing they ask is they see my last name, then they ask my village, and then they can guess which religion I am, and then they put me in a box. Oh, he's Greek Orthodox, which is fine, because the problem more in Lebanon is between Sunni, Shias, and Maronite Christians. Greek Orthodox is minority Christian, so it's no big deal, it's okay. But they do that. And even myself, I started to do that. So when we were talking yesterday, I know from your last name that Shapiro is a traditional Jewish last name. We have Thais Gasparian and Shehazian, she's Armenian, and they started to do that. And in Lebanon, we see that everything's about identity. In Brazil, less. So I want you to talk more about like this thing as identity. How do you see yourself, like how we see our, we constructed this identity, because I have friends who are grandsons of Lebanese, and they don't see themselves as Lebanese as I do myself. And also because, and I was talking to you yesterday, and most of the people see myself as a journalist, I see myself as a swimmer. So that's also strength. And when I go to swim, I connect with the Russians who swim with me in the ocean here in New York, as I was telling you, like I swim like in the ocean in Brighton Beach here in New York. So how the people constructed this identity, and how you can deconstruct that when you are trying to solve a conflict. How do you do that? How can you put aside all this identity that, like you were saying, like you are Jewish, you grew up in a Jewish family from Latvia and Poland, but you are married to an Irish woman, like Irish American woman. So how do you, because it's there, and here in the United States, people talk more about that than in Brazil. So you're African American, you're Chinese American, you're Lebanese American, you're Jewish, you're Italian American, you're Muslim, whatever. So how do you deal with that?
You know, it's a wonderful question. I don't think you can put identity aside. I think people assume you can, but this is the glasses we wear. We don't realize we're wearing glasses. We assume everybody else knows that they're wearing glasses, but we see the world through our identity. The problem is what happens when my identity conflicts with your identity. And many people will say there's certain conflicts in our world that are just hopelessly intractable. And when I hear that, I'm like, I almost shake with this sort of core belief that nothing ultimately is impossible, or, you know, hopefully. I think there are two different kinds of identity, or at least I suggest. One is what I would call our core identity. This is the spectrum of characteristics that define who I am, Guga, who you are, who we are as individuals or members of groups. And I put together a little acronym to help try and clarify what are some of the essential pieces of your core identity. Brave. Because by the way, you seem like you have a wonderful memory. You're already like, he's from Latvia and Poland. I'm like, how does he remember all this? I have a terrible memory, so I need acronyms to help remember anything. Brave. These are the elements I believe are key elements of your core identity. The B. What are your beliefs? What are the basic ideas that help to define who you are, that feel fixed? Never will they change. R. What are the meaningful rituals that we do? Not just habits, but those things that are meaningful to in our lives, meaningful to us, that help to define who we are. So often religion offers certain rituals. We take off for certain holidays. We do certain things on the holidays. Certain rituals can be even more secularized. I am addicted to coffee, to Starbucks coffee. And I go there every day. And during the pandemic, when Starbucks shut down for some time, I didn't fully feel like myself. Yeah. So there was that part of my identity. A, allegiances. To whom, to what do I hold loyalty? Is it to my religious group, to my racial friends, to my colleagues of a certain race, to those of the same gender? Where do I hold my allegiances? Nationality? The V stands for values. What are those basic principles that help to define who I am? Values often are expressed in the form of a single word: humility, dignity, love. The E stands for emotionally meaningful experiences. So what are those experiences that I have had, or my group has had at some point, that help to define who I am? There's this wonderfully insightful psychoanalyst, Turkish Cypriot psychoanalyst, Vamik Volkan, who talks about what he calls chosen traumas and chosen glories. That every collective, every group has some experiences from the past that help to define who they are in the present. The past can be 500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, but he suggests there's a time collapse. And in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, you have the Al-Nakba, you have the Holocaust, different in many ways, but each helping to define a certain group's identity. That's core identity. And not to go too far in response to your question, Guga, but this is where I got stuck. Because the question in my head then was, well, Israelis have their own core identity. Palestinians have their own core identity. Those things are largely fixed because of beliefs and values and so on. How can they ever come to agreements without conceding or an element of their identity? And my one son, my youngest son, loves to play with magnets. He taught me all about neodymium magnets. What's striking about magnets is that you have one magnet, you have another magnet. The material of the magnet is pretty fixed. But the question is, what's happening in the space between them? What's the energy between magnet X and magnet Y? To me, that's where all of my theory lies. How do you change what I call the relational identity between groups or individuals? It's that space between that I've been working, with many others to try to define, because that to me is where we have opportunity to resolve what seem like quite intractable conflicts. You don't need to sacrifice your identity, give up your beliefs. Let's change the nature of the relationship between you and the other side, and maybe we can move forward then.
So now I want to ask a question, like building on the Israeli Palestinians. In the 90s, we saw that was an atmosphere for dialogue between both sides, especially when Yitzhak Rabin was alive in Israel. But at the time, both sides, most of the people on both sides believed in peace. There was the peace process. And so when you have that environment, and now when you look at the environment, it's not the same at all. So Israel went to the right, they were disappointed with the peace process, there were the Intifada, and the Palestinians also, like, they have a dysfunctional government in the West Bank, a corrupt government with Fatah in the West Bank. They have a radical Islamist group in Gaza. So how can you reconnect both sides, since both are disappointed? They would like to have peace, but they don't trust each other anymore as they did in the 90s.
Right. It's a great question. And I also would love your thoughts on this too, Guga. I'll share mine. I'd love to hear yours too. I don't think that peace just naturally happens. I think it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of setup work. The conditions in the 90s did not just magically happen. There was work behind the scenes that many people were doing within the diplomatic corps and academic quarters and so on, that allowed the conditions to be such that the leadership could further move things in that direction. I completely agree with you that one of the major challenges right now is, yes, to some degree, the cross-group problems between Israelis and Palestinians, but I think the bigger problem is internal on each side. There's not really a consistent, cohesive voice to represent either side. How do you negotiate if your home is not in order? To me, I think that's a first step. Just to give you a sample, a sense of how I would think through these things. It was right after the failed Camp David negotiations of 2000. There was a set of Israelis and Palestinians who had been involved formally in that process, who were now extremely despairing, felt helpless and hopeless, and they came to the Harvard Negotiation Project, and they said to us, what do we do? And out of that, we all conceived of this idea that we ultimately called IPNP, the Israeli-Palestinian Negotiating Partners Project. Each year, to the Harvard area, ultimately quasi-affiliated with Harvard, came about 10 very influential Israelis and about 10 very influential Palestinians, some formally connected to the political and government world, and some through media, through business, and so on. What did they do? They literally sat in classes for a week, as we taught them all of these different tools, methods of more cooperative negotiation. What really happened, I think, was that they gained a common language on how to deal with negotiation. And two, more important from my perspective, they built relationships. You know, many of them would go out into Harvard Square in the evenings and talk, despite the taboo against this. Within the safety of Harvard Square, they were able to build those relationships. And so, for example, when there was the siege on the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem in 2003 or 4, something around then, this was a 37 and a 38 and a day, half-day standoff. How did this thing get resolved? It was two people from the group that we had trained. And one calls the other up on the phone and basically says, what do we do? What's your advice? And through a simple, straightforward conversation, they were able to negotiate a peaceful way forward. So that organization fizzled over time for a number of complex reasons. We're working with a number of other kinds of organizations now on these kinds of projects. Long story short, the question in my head is, how do you create the conditions which can allow leadership and emerging leadership to take charge and to take ownership of a formal political peace process or negotiation process? And so my goal, my own work, is working with a lot of these rising leaders who are at the top or supporting the top level leadership in thinking more systematically about how to negotiate, and recognizing that negotiation is not just a zero-sum game. There may be some creative ways to allow everybody's interest to get met to a workable extent, certainly that's better than the alternative. Yeah. Oops.
I'm muted because I have to apologize because there's a renovation going on here. So I mute all the time, then I mute. But Professor, the Palestinians and the Israelis, they share some values, and even they eat hummus and falafel, and there are Palestinians playing in Israelis soccer teams. They like soccer, they like basketball, they live in the same region. They are Middle Eastern from the Levant. So in a way, and they know each other, especially before Oslo, because there were Palestinians working in Israel, Palestinians studying in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. There are 20% of the Israeli population is Palestinian, the Arab Israelis. So yeah. you can, they share some values. So you can have dialogue, and we had, and they understand each other. But in the case, for example, of the United States and Taliban, we saw now, Trump negotiated with Taliban the withdrawal of the United States, and we know that Taliban is in power now, and the United States needs to deal with Taliban, especially to give humanitarian aid, to try to press them in a way for the woman to have at least some rights. How do you deal with a person or a group that you don't share any value? Because as we know, Taliban is a terrorist, jihadi, extremist, against women, medieval, everything that's bad, Taliban is. How do you deal with those people? Because you have to. So, and in life, sometimes you have to deal with people that you don't share any value. So, what would be the easiest way to resolve this conflict?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think in order to effectively influence another person, another group, I need to understand first where their mind is at. So I would, if I were advising, for example, the Biden administration on how to negotiate with the Taliban, I would want to bring on board academics, people from the region who really understand the complexity of values, the philosophy, the religious mindset, the social interests, the political instincts of the Taliban. So the more I can understand their mindset, the better able I am to influence that mindset. Two, when I go to try to negotiate with the Taliban, if I would, I want to be able to speak in language that they understand. And I'm not just saying here Arabic or English or something like that, in the cultural language. It's one thing for me to say, don't put into practice what we believe to be basic fundamental human rights, because this is our belief system, how does that mindset, that thinking, that approach, that principle operate within their world? How can we turn it into something that makes sense for them, given their own values, given the way they see the world? That's going to be much more persuasive than trying to simply impose a value system upon them. We've seen the problem of that over 20 years. Ultimately, it didn't work. I mean, it did for some time, but I think if we want to negotiate with the Taliban, and that's an if you want to, first you need to understand that mindset and then figure out ways to try to serve their interests that are aligned with yours, within their sphere of identity, the way they think. I suppose that's controversial, but thought number one. Controversial thought number two is, to really influence somebody, I believe you need a relationship. Guga, we haven't met before in person. If I were to ask you, for a favor over email before we met versus after we met, I have a feeling on each side, we'd be much more inclined to do so after we've seen each other eye to eye and we've met personally. It gets complicated when you're dealing with an organization like Taliban that's deemed by many different countries as a terrorist organization. There are laws in the United States against even myself. I can't interact, as I understand the laws, with the Taliban directly because they're deemed a terrorist organization. So how do you even communicate? But I think there still are ways. Might there be some agents of, for example, the United States who can meet with some of the agents of the Taliban in, let's say, Qatar, and they can start to, go out for tea, build that relationship that makes influence easier, and maybe the agents on at least the US side or some other side, they're not so high level that it's deeming any credibility onto or legitimacy onto the Taliban. It's simply trying to open up a channel of effective communication so that we can better influence in that situation. Those are some of the first things I'd think about from a negotiation perspective. Again, if one wants to negotiate with the Taliban, if.
Professor, now moving both in the United States, in Brazil, and most of the countries, we see huge polarization now. We know that many Democrats don't talk to Republicans. In Brazil, it's the same, like people who support Bolsonaro on one side, people who don't support, and then you see fights among family members, but usually those fights happen in the social networks, like on WhatsApp, on Facebook, Twitter, whatever. But usually your digital life, your digital identity plays stronger than your real identity, because you're saying now, if you met the other side in person, would be different. If you talk in the phone, would be different. Do you think that the social networks are negative for the connections among people, and they are actually making conflict instead of helping to resolve conflicts?
I think technology works in both directions. It is absolutely a two-edged sword. On the one hand, we're able to talk right now and to have all of our Brazilian friends and colleagues here with us. It's phenomenal. I think, especially in this pandemic, most of us would literally go insane if it weren't for technology to keep us connected. I think at the political levels, there is this great strength in people sharing their ideas, learning about other ideas. The dangers are twofold. One is the bubble, that I only get information from my own bubble, from my own group. The algorithms feed me what I already know. They reinforce my biased perspectives of politics. And two, the other big problem is exactly what you're saying. I was just talking with some of my students about this last week, how easy it is to hide behind a fake name online. Instead of being Dan Shapiro professor, I'll call myself, Bob. And I then can criticize Guga's most recent journalistic article, and I'm going to call you all these evil names. but we're not really having a dialogue. You know, it's not even a monologue per se. It's just a set of swords I'm throwing at you. It's a battle. To me, that's not very productive at all. But I think you're right. I think it was in 2014, a lot of these technologies came out. It really popularized Twitter and so on, and you could see. And there's some research to show the spike in the amount of polarization starting in those specific years. Technology can be good, but technology can be a challenge. One of the ways I'm trying to get around that with my own students is to, this semester, with my class, we're doing a civil discourse project where we're putting them into small groups of 8. They're choosing a politically sensitive issue that they're all interested in discussing and learning more about. And they're going to talk about various sub-issues within that over 5 sessions. We're training them in advance on how you talk, how you listen, how you can facilitate so it's constructive, but boy, it's not easy. You know, and a lot of the concepts I talk about in my newest book really are the challenges to that productive conversation. Guga, if you say you voted for one party in the United States and I say I voted for another and we start talking politics, rationally, each of us may have good arguments why we voted for who we did. But all of a sudden, what you're saying can start to feel like an assault on my sacred. And I immediately start getting into a tribalistic mindset. It's me versus you, Guga. And now we're not going to have a conversation anymore. You know, now it's a battle. But I think that technology can be a large impetus for a lot of these challenges, these insulated conversations. Yeah.
Professor, one last question before we open to the public.
Actually, can I interrupt you?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
I used to think that curiosity was just a sort of like an okay idea, almost like not lame, but like, yeah, be curious. More and more, given the political climate that we are in, I think curiosity is one of the biggest gifts that we can give ourselves and give our countries, to help move forward beyond polarization. I was recently fishing with one of my sons over the summer, and someone came up to us, and this guy just looked like he was a real tough guy, and just he's a little scary look. Like, I don't want to get on his bad side. And he came over because he could tell I'm a total loser with fishing. I don't know how to do it really. My son was getting disappointed, and he helps us out, but he starts talking politics. And he starts talking politics that are very different from my politics. And the question was, what do I do? Now, I could start attacking his comments back and say, no, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. And I don't know what would have happened. He might have defended, it might have turned, a little ugly. I decided to become curious. And it was an amazing conversation. I really wanted to understand, why do you think that? What's behind your politics? Help me understand. And I walked away really enriched. I had a better understanding of not just him, but what I believe to be a number of different people, within my own country and what they are thinking at this point in time. And so it moved from something that could have been very antagonistic to something that was very ultimately intellectually and even emotionally enriching.
Professor, like talking about this conversation you had, there are people that we care. And it's not the difference of being liberal and conservative, that's fine. But there are people who we care and became QAnon or anti-vax, or like they don't believe in climate change. How do we talk to those people? Because actually, like, we don't want them to be anti-vax or for them not to believe in climate change or for them to be QAnon. How do you talk to those people that you actually care and you have to change their mind?
Well, I think the answer is in your question. How do we talk to them? I think it's the wrong question in a way. It's how do we listen to them? Because the assumption of talking to them is and I'm not arguing that anything you're saying is wrong value-wise, but the assumption there is I am all knowing, I am all truthful. Like, a truth is on my side, legitimacy is all on my side. You, other person, are pathetic. You don't have truth on your side. There's no rationale to what you're thinking. There's no basis. And I think it's that shift. You know, one can still believe that to some degree, but I think it's a shift to try to understand what is it. You know, if you don't want to to get the vaccine, help me understand. Okay, you say this and that. Well, help me understand what's behind that assumption. I still don't get it. So you're saying this because of this, and I'm digging deeper and deeper into what the other person's assumptions are. I don't think I can change somebody's mind without really understanding where their mind currently is at. Appreciating their perspective does not mean agreeing with it. It means understanding the depths of it. But I think that's step number one. I have in my extended family, there's a conflict between parts. I'm trying to keep my family a little anonymous and safe here. But there is a conflict exactly along the lines that you're talking about in my extended family. And it really has fractured a part of the family more wholly. And I think part of the problem is that neither side is really listening to the other side. It's just, it's like a debate. Here's why you should, here's why you shouldn't, here's why you should, why you shouldn't. A debate has a winner and a loser. And I think at the end of the day, really, the way I would think about civil discourse is that everybody comes to a deeper understanding. Through that, I'm much more able to influence. You know, if you really care about your kids, as I hear you do, let's go and look at some of the science together. If you really care about climate change, let's go and make a meeting, or let's listen to some YouTube videos of some scientists and their views on climate change. And let's also listen to those who you subscribe to who say climate change is a farce, and let's try and think through that analytically together. We're now sort of like, they're going to resist me less. There's a core concept that I think plays out a lot in negotiation, which is autonomy. Autonomy is the freedom to make decisions without somebody else telling you what to do. And if you and I are in the midst of a conversation and you feel like I'm telling you, Guga, you're totally wrong on climate change, you're totally wrong on vaccines, I'm going to tell you what's right. Even if at a rational level, you might go, he's sort of right. The moment you feel like I'm telling you, imposing on your autonomy, is the moment you're going to shut down. So it's less to me about the content than how we have these conversations, where there's a sense of mutual appreciation, freedom to share views without feeling judged per se. And within that, I actually think you're going to be much more powerful to persuade within that context.
Professor, I think now we can open to the questions from the public. And thank you, like it was a great presentation. Thank you for answering. And like I think now, Thais, Luis, I think you can start asking the questions from the public, no?
Hello, everyone. Hi, Guga, and hi, Jen. Thank you so much for this incredible conversation. Well, I'm Thais. My name is Thais Gasparian, and I'm representing the Harvard Alumni Club of Brazil. I'm honored to be here and to help with this Q&A. First of all, thank you all for sending so many interesting questions. As we do have a time limit, we will need to select some of them. Well, first question is from Pedro Rodriguez. Is there any situation in which negotiation is not desirable or recommended, or is negotiation always the best option?
Great, thank you, Pedro. Nice to hear from you. Negotiation is but one of many ways of dealing with differences. And there are dozens of different ways. So Guga, you and I get into a conflict over what? Let's make it about something with money. What are we in a conflict about?
Can be money or baseball, whatever.
Okay, so you and I had a bet, and I didn't pay you back, right? So one way that Guga could try to deal with this difference between us is he could knock on my door. Guga swims, he's much stronger than I am. He could beat me up, use violence on some level and take my wallet and get the money that rightly was his because he won the bet. So we often do, around the world, unfortunately, violence is very popular. It's one way of dealing with difference. Another way, and that's self-help. Guga just takes this into his own hands. He's not negotiating with me. In negotiation, he knocks on my door and says, Dan, you owe me some money. And I say, oh, I thought we were kidding. I thought we were going to use fake money, monopoly money. This is real. We're negotiating. The benefit of negotiating is each of us has a lot of power over the process of our conversation and over the outcome. I can decide to pay or not pay. He can try to force me or not. That's negotiation, but it's not always most useful. Sometimes Guga and I may not come to an agreement alone, and we invite Thais in, and she becomes the mediator. And Thais then says, well, Guga, what's your perspective? Shapiro, what's your perspective? What do you think you should do? In mediation now, Thais is controlling the process, but we still have outcome control. As good as Thais might be, maybe we still don't come to an agreement. So then we bring it to either an arbitrator or even a judge. They now control both process and outcome. In our conflict, Guga and I have lost a lot of power, both process and outcome power. There are benefits to court, for example. It's often public record. If you're dealing with a sexual harassment issue, maybe you want it on public record. On the other hand, there's certain issues that may be best fit for something like negotiation. So it's just an example of some of the many ways there are of dealing with differences. Those are some of the main ones I see. Final point though, I don't think everything is negotiable. I think more is negotiable than we think. But if I walk down the street, I have a supermarket there, there's a Coca-Cola machine. I go to that Coca-Cola machine and I say, hey, Coca-Cola machine, 10 Cokes, $5. That Coca-Cola machine is going to go, no, 10 Cokes, $10. I think some people act like a Coca-Cola machine. They are resistant, very resistant to negotiation, but I think most people aren't. If you can build the right kind of relationship with them. Thank you. And Guga, feel free to jump in with your thoughts throughout as well for any of this. Yes.
No, actually, I want to hear you. I'm learning today more than I have been learning in a while. So it's great to hear you more about that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Next question is from Gabriel Maya. How does the technology impact the negotiation environment? What are the main differences between face-to-face negotiation and remote negotiation?
So we touched on that a bit.
Yeah, it was a question that I asked him.
Yeah, so we've touched on that already. I think about one of my colleagues, Roger Fisher, really known around the world as the grandfather of the modern field of negotiation. He wrote the seminal book on negotiation called Getting to Yes with some of our other colleagues. And our organization back in the 90s was asked to consult in South Africa when there was negotiations around the putting a close to apartheid, putting together a new constitution and so on. So our team was there. It was after a lot of that after we had helped out in that situation that, I'm remembering the story now. At one point, Cyril Ramaphosa, our team was supposed to consult with Cyril Ramaphosa and their team within the African National Congress, and they canceled. And Roger and some of our other colleagues were already in South Africa, and Roger had a blank day in his calendar, and he goes to meet with Cyril Ramaphosa. He was supposed to do the training. They had canceled the training. They go out for lunch. At the end of lunch, Cyril says to Roger, can you do the training tomorrow? And Roger says, what do you mean? You canceled the training on me. This is why I'm here, with nothing to do today. And he said, but Cyril Ramaphosa then says, but he didn't know you. And Roger says, what do you mean I didn't know you? You didn't know me. I know all about you. I tried to help get you a fellowship at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard. I've known all about you. And at this point, Ramaphosa says, yes, you've known all about me, but we've never sat down together. We've never looked in each other's eyes. We didn't really know each other. It was compelling. I think there is something that really speaks to the power of human connection. And I think we all feel it as we suffer through the distancing effect of the pandemic. To your question, I see this in the way teaching happens, socio-emotional teaching. When I'm teaching negotiation online, it's effective, but I think it's distant. You know, last week when I was with my class, we're all masked, but we're in person. There's just this different energy in the room. Everybody laughs together. People look around, you know, embarrassed by a comment. You see one person cross their arms and it becomes a train of people crossing their arms. There is something, I believe, to that, to the power of that human connection that is particularly potent within the context of negotiation. And last point, you know, so much of the work we do really is how do you authentically capture that human power to help people get their needs met more effectively. Mutual gains.
Thank you, Dan. Next question is from Ricardo Vani Morici. Professor Shapiro, what's the most difficult characteristic to find in an outstanding negotiator?
Oh, that's, to me, there's an easy answer there. It is back to what Guga and I talked about, listening. It is listening, listening, listening. And we all too often call these things negotiation talks, right? You go to a negotiation talk, to a summit, but it's called a talk. Wrong word. It should be called a negotiation listens. I guess I'd say two things. One is the power of listening, but two is what's the intent behind the listening? I think all too often we conceive of negotiation as an adversarial battle. It is me versus you, us versus them. Think about the Brazilian or the US political system. It's us versus them. And I think the most enlightened negotiators have a very different vision and emotional feel for what negotiation is. It's not me versus you. It is the two of us facing the same shared problems. It's not us versus them on the reform questions in Brazil. No, this is a Brazilian question. It's a societal question. And yes, there is conflict, and yes, there is difference. You can approach that difference adversarially, or you could sit on the same side of the table and say, you have some perspectives and interests that I don't. I have some perspectives and interests that you don't. Let's sit down and problem solve this thing together. There's that mentality that I think is the other component of the enlightened negotiator. You know, the listening then becomes almost the way of doing it, but it's that strategic framing of the entire relationship that is so essential, so hard to do. And one last point on this, people sometimes say, yeah, but that sounds soft, you know, and I'm here as a negotiator, I'm ready to fight. I don't think you need to lose that fighter mentality. The question is, what are you fighting for? And I, you know, when working with various different groups, would urge people, fight, 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 but fight to work cooperatively. Fight for the we. You know, Mandela was not a soft guy. He was a tough, tough politician, but he fought for the we, for the greater we. And I think that's the enlightened, tough thing to do, to recognize that, to do it.
Professor,
Guga,
so yeah. In your view, like, it's not a win-lose situation. You have to play for the win-win. So you shouldn't play like Trump, who thinks he's the best negotiator ever. So you have to understand that, like, both sides can win, right?
That's the goal. That is the goal, is to recognize, is there a possible agreement that can be had that meets your interests and my interests to the extent possible? There will be conflicting interests. And the question then is, how do you deal with the conflicting interests on each side? What we I think the danger in the American system, or perhaps in the Brazilian system, is that there's so much political tribalism that people fail to work together on issues that are of shared concern. But there are the differences. Typically, we deal with these conflicting interests through a battle of wills. You know, one side says, you will listen to me, and the other side says, no, you will listen to me. Well, I have more nuclear bombs than you. Well, I have more nuclear bombs than you. That's not helpful. That was the Cold War. A much better approach that I would advocate, instead of focusing people on what you will or won't do, focus on what you should or shouldn't do. Bring some sort of standards of legitimacy into the conversation. Why is that compensation more legitimate than this one? What's the basis? What's the objective criteria you're using there? We still might have a societal debate, but now the debate is not about who's right or wrong, but which criteria is most effective for moving our society forward. You know, yeah.
Thank
I mean,
you.
just oh, never mind. I'd rather hear more questions. I'd blabber. Let me stop. Thais, please.
Professor Shapiro, any book recommendations for negotiations and history?
Oh God, Guga, you're going to be better at this question than I am. I can tell your mind is full of this. What do you think? And I'll think as well. What do you think?
No, on negotiation, like we should read your books. That's what I would recommend. And history depends, like which country or which region or which time of history you wanna read about. Like here, I have many books about the Ottoman Empire, about Palestine, about Turkey, Lebanon, Syria. So because that's what I like to follow, but it depends a lot. But people should read your book.
I won't say you're wrong there. No, but to that point though, I do see that. I mean, the focus of the work I do in negotiation is on processes. It's less so on content. What processes can help people get their interests met to the extent possible and society's interests met? I see it, and I was talking with my dear friend Luis, Alberto, who's on the this call today. Earlier, we were talking that I see there being 3 different levels to negotiation, which really reads as somewhat of a history of the modern field of negotiation. The field of negotiation started popularly with the book Getting to Yes, published in 1981. I believe the field started technically way back in more than 50 years ago with this beautiful mind, Mary Parker Follett, a management scholar who wrote about win-win negotiations in sophisticated and beautiful ways. But the modern field, Getting to Yes, offers this approach to win-win negotiation, which they call interest-based or principled negotiation. It's wonderful. It's also very rational. And so in the late 90s into the early 2000s, Roger Fisher and I then published a book in English. It's called Beyond Reason, Using Emotions as You Negotiate, arguing that just as important as rationality is emotion. How do you deal with the emotional dimension? In that book, we offer 5 basic concepts that our research suggests tend to stimulate a lot of useful emotions in negotiation. But emotion isn't quite at the level of depth of the modern challenge of conflict or negotiation. Like Guga and I were talking about, to me, there's rationality, there's emotionality, but then beneath emotions, identity. How do you deal with conflict when identity is at play? And that's really what inspired this newest book of mine, Negotiating the Non-Negotiable. The question was, how do you deal with conflicts when identity is deeply implicated and utterly complicated? I mean, I try reading the philosophy of identity, and it's complicated stuff. How do you make it practically useful for leadership, for all of us trying to negotiate our complex lives? So those are some of the things I'd recommend. My own interest, I think it just depends upon your interests. My interests are in psychology. So many of the heroes of our field of psychology, like Kurt Lewin, Jerome Frank, some of these others really offer, I think, some insightful perspectives that lie at the roots of effective human interaction. Yeah.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Guga. I believe this is our last question. Actually, it's for Guga, but I believe it also you can also reply, Jen. It's from Pedro Rodriguez. Guga, how do you prepare yourself to interview someone with a very different point of view of yours? How can you question someone without having your views impacting the debate and the interview?
Like if I interview someone, I'm there to hear that person. Like I will ask questions, and in the questions I can try to put my point of view, but like I will hear the other side. That's what's most important when you are interviewing someone who disagrees with you. But I like to listen a lot. I like to see the other side. So like covering, for example, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I went many times to Israel, to Gaza, to the West Bank. I always like to tell, like between Syria and Israel, like I went to the Golan Heights. On the Syrian side 3 times, I went to the Golan Heights. On the Israeli side, I went to the border between Israel and Lebanon. On the Lebanese side, many times, I went to the Israeli side. So I like to hear, and then actually become closer to the people, like even when you disagree. And people might not know, but like there are even famous people who are really right-wing in Brazil who disagree with me, who happens to be my friends. And like, so I call them sometimes, and I like to hear, doing like what Professor Shapiro was saying. So I like to hear the other side, unless the person is really like, for example, in the Israeli-Palestinian, if the person says we should kill all Jews, then it's different. But then I wouldn't interview a person who thinks like that. I will interview people who are smart and who can disagree with me, but I respect. The former governor of Professor Shapiro State, Mitt Romney, is a person that I don't agree in many issues, but I really admire him. So, so people like Romney is people that I like that I can disagree, but I respect his values and his person. So I think I answered the question. I don't know.
Can I ask you a question, Guga?
Yes.
So what would happen then internally? I'm just curious what happens inside of you when you're interviewing someone whose views are very different from yours, who it almost feels like an assault on your sacred and what you deeply believe. What are you feeling inside, and how do you maintain that sense of objectivity as a reporter, as a journalist? What do you do at that point? How's that work?
If it's a difference of opinion, it's fine. The person has a different opinion. If the person is saying something wrong, then I try to correct that person in a polite way. For example, after a terrorist attack, another person, like actually an academic, said that the Munich terrorist attack in the Olympics was an Islamist attack. And then I said, no, it was not. Actually, the leader of that terrorist attack was a Christian, an atheist Christian, and many people who were involved were Marxists. They were actually Palestinian nationalists, those terrorists. So I try to correct the person, or when the person say, oh, I'm so sad for Lebanon that Christians are persecuted in Lebanon, I say, no, actually the president of Lebanon is Christian, as half of the parliament of Lebanon is also Christian. There is no persecution of Christians in Lebanon. There are in many countries in the Middle East, but actually not in Lebanon. So I try to correct the person. But that, if it's a fact, if it's a difference of opinion, it's fine. The person has a different view of the world.
Yeah, that's great.
Thais?
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Guga. And well, before we finish, I kindly ask you to give your final considerations. And thank you so much for this. I think it was amazing. For me, it was amazing to hear both of you. And well, I give you the word now.
Guga, which one of us goes first?
You go first.
Okay. No, my only thought, what couple, first, thank you to all of you. This is such a wonderful opportunity. I'm so I'm excited. I want to keep talking for another couple hours. Guga, it's been amazing to connect with you. I guess my last thought is a challenge for all of you who are on this Zoom experience right now. Today, maybe tomorrow, but try today. Find somebody who has a political perspective that is different from your own, that feels quite different. And I would sort of challenge you to try to talk with that person, but not talk, to really listen, to try to understand their perspective well enough that by the end of your conversation with that person, they walk away going, wow, I feel understood. And while you're doing that, notice all of the internal emotions going on inside of you. The desire to fight back, to argue back, to debate, to offer counter evidence. Hold that. Don't share that. Your goal is simply to help that other person feel and be understood, which can be an advancement, an expansion for both of you. So I close today just with that little challenge, which I think if all of us do that, society starts to grow, starts to understand one another. The threads of connection become that much, more interwoven.
And Professor Shapiro, thank you for being with us. Like, it was a pleasure, like your lecture, your answers, like it was great talking to you. Like, you have this charisma. It's amazing to hear you, and I learned a lot yesterday and today. I will do your challenge. Actually, myself, I should do that more, because sometimes we are on TV and we think that like we are always right, and we almost give lectures when we are on TV and say that and that, and like Trump is wrong, and I don't know, like we just. So I think like we should listen more, and was great. And I would tell people, I started reading your book yesterday, and I'm almost finishing now. I'm reading on ebook. I want the hard copy, so just to let you know.
In the mailbox today.
And thank you for the Harvard alumni, and as a member of the Columbia alumni, and I also like was a great honor to be with you. I always say that Harvard is, but Professor Shapiro won't understand, is the Flamengo of the universities. Columbia is Palmeiras of the universities. So people who follow soccer in Brazil will understand. And thank you, Luis. Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Thais.
Thank you all, and thank you for everyone, all the participants that are here. And on behalf of the Harvard Alumni Club of Brazil, and also on behalf of the Harvard Brazil office, I thank you all for being here and sending so many questions and interesting questions. So thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Great afternoon. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Guga. Thank you, Thais.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.